All right, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about American federalism. Federalism is a pretty simple concept, but it's something that I think a lot of students have trouble with because they tend to conflate it with separation of powers and checks and balances. Um, and at its most basic level, it's very simple, but it can get complicated, and it's got a lot of stuff to it. So understanding federalism is simple, but then there's some things that make it a little bit more difficult to kind of understand or make it complicated a bit. Okay, so federalism is, at its most basic level, a division between territorial power and state power. So basically, it's a system where you give some sort of territory power, and then you give a national government power as well. Okay, and it can be done in a few different ways, and it's not something unique to the United States. In fact, federalism exists in several countries around the world. Germany is a federal country or state. I believe Australia is federal as well. But at its most basic, it's just that division of power between national and state governments. Now, there's a few different ways of formulating federalism. Up until the progressive era, the early 20th century, we had what's known as dual federalism, which is basically where the federal or the national government, and that can be kind of confusing, but when I say federal government, basically what I mean is the national government, like Washington, D.C., right? The national government, that's like the president, Congress, the Supreme Court. Under dual federalism has its own powers, and then the states have their own powers, and they're pretty much distinct, right? So like under dual federalism, education is completely the role of the states, and military defense is completely the role of the federal government. Right? And there's no there's no overlapping, there's no mixture between the two. Okay. Generally, this means that there's a smaller role for national government, right? Because the national government doesn't need to do all kinds of things. It can allow the states to do what they want. Okay. Now, this might seem like the best option because there's kind of a saying that like local solutions are better for local problems, meaning that people at the state level tend to know what problems their states face and are better off at addressing them. And we'll talk about that a little bit and maybe why that's not so true in some cases. Okay, but moving on, cooperative federalism. So with the Great Depression, there was a great need for the federal government to step in and to exert itself where the states couldn't. Okay, states were having a difficult time ensuring that people were employed, ensuring that people had food, that they had housing. Right, the Great Depression is a really difficult time period in the United States. So the federal government steps up and it starts getting more involved. And this ushers in an era known as cooperative federalism. And cooperative federalism means that there's overlapping of duties. So, for example, educational standards, right? Education used to be completely up to the states. Well, in time, we see too much difference in different states when it comes to educational outcomes. Right? Some states performing really poorly, other states performing better. So how do we standardize this, and what can we do to ensure that people across the entire country are getting an adequate education, right? So that's how that is implemented, right? Now you can look at these two things, and a way of remembering them is that dual federalism is likened to a layer cake, meaning that you have a layer that is state government and a layer that is national government, and they're completely distinct, and you can tell what's the national government and you can tell what's the state government. Cooperative federalism, because the shared roles between national and state government start to overlap, it's known as a marble cake system or marble cake federalism, right? Everything's kind of mushed together. Is it the federal government's role? Is it the national government's role? Or is it the state's role, right? Sometimes these are very intertwined and kind of mixed together, okay? Devolution starts in about the late 1970s up to the 1980s, and it's a reverting back to giving power to the states. Okay, it's also known as New Federalism, and the idea being that we need to empower the states to do the best that they can, right? To implement laws and to find solutions on their own, and further to not be beholden to the national government and need money from the national government, right? It's okay. Come here, bud. Come here. Come here. I'm recording, but I want to show off these pups. This is Digby. And Tulip. Come here. Come here. And this is Tulip. All right. Okay, so to get back to it, some people believe that the states need to have more control. So that's the idea of devolution. And we've seen that since the late 1970s and into the 80s. Okay, so there's this topic that we can think of as fiscal federalism. And fiscal federalism is basically the way that the money works, right? So what ways does the federal government and the national government control the states through the use of money? Okay, so one way that they do that is through what are known as grants. So block grants give money for broad state usage. Categorical grants can only be used on narrowly defined projects. And then there's also mandates. So let's kind of go through these one by one. So block grants would be like the national government giving money to the state of Texas for whatever. It could be something as broad as education. It could be something as broad as highways, right? Categorical grants, however, they can only use that money for narrowly defined projects. Okay? Now you can imagine, what do you think that the federal government is going to be more likely to give? Are they going to be more likely to want to give the money for broad state usage where the states can use it for anything that they so choose? Or will they be more likely to give those grants to states that are narrowly defined, right? Well, think about it when you ask your parents for money. Okay, so you ask your parents for money. They might ask you why. I mean, maybe they're very generous and they say, yeah, take this money, go do whatever the hell you want to with it, right? That's cool. But what they're more likely to do is say, yes, you can use this money for this specific thing. And what they might do in that case is actually require you to do something, right? They might say, yeah, if you complete such and such, if you complete your chores, if you take out the garbage, if you do this, if you do that, right? Because money is a way of exerting power, right? And so much like your parents might use money to get you to do things, the federal government's going to entice the states by using these grants to sway them one way or another, right? And just realize that they're more likely to give grants that are tied to certain strings, right? Where there's strings attached, and also where they're limited in scope, right? Because the federal government wants to dictate things. Lastly are mandates, and mandates are, states really hate mandates because they're unfunded, and oftentimes they try to challenge these in court. They're unfunded, and it requires the state executive to carry out some sort of enforcement role. This can be problematic, right? We saw an issue in Fort Worth. Right? In Fort Worth, one of the issues that we saw was, this is a kind of a broader issue, but the Trump administration wanted to use local police departments to enforce immigration. Well, immigration is actually a federal duty, right? It's not something that local police departments are technically should be doing, though maybe they want to, depending on what part of the country they're in. But effectively, police departments were in some instances mandated or told that they would get funding cuts if they did not carry out that enforcement role for immigration, right? And that could be an example of a mandate. All right, separation of powers. So separation of powers is kind of distinct from federalism, but it's a central feature of our Constitution. Federalist number 51 says that the structure of government must furnish the proper checks and balances between different departments. Okay, so this is the classic kind of idea of ambition must be made to counteract ambition, right? Meaning that we want to have a government that is kind of counterintuitively to a certain extent, but that is combative, right? And why do we want a government that's combative against, like, Congress being combative against the president being combative against the courts and all that? Well, because we don't want to centralize power in any one branch. Okay? So this sounds great, right? We use branches to check the power of other branches. One issue with this, though, is when all branches are co-opted by one single party. So political parties can undermine separation of powers a bit, right? If you have all Republicans or all Democrats across every single branch of government, right? House, Senate, presidency, and then the president chooses a majority in the Supreme Court, then that separation of powers loosens. It becomes much weaker in that instance. And that's actually generally when you see things get done, is when there's less conflict between the branches of government, okay? So when you see more laws get written, for better or for worse, right? Okay, so moving on. The 10th Amendment. So we haven't talked that much yet about the way that the Constitution is structured, but immediately after the Constitution is written, they say, well, we need to have some protections, right? We need to have some protections. And those protections are added to the Constitution immediately. So if anybody ever tells you that, the Constitution is, divinely inspired or something like that, look to the fact that it literally was amended immediately, right? It was, they saw the problems with it immediately, and rather than go back and actually put these in the Constitution, they amend it. Okay, so the first 10 amendments are called the Bill of Rights, and the 10th Amendment is important to this concept of federalism because it's known as the reserved powers. And it says that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to it by to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, and then kind of tossed in at the end, or to the people. Right? The people don't generally think of this as applying to the people, but it does. It applies to the people. So things that the Constitution doesn't explicitly forbid the states or the people from doing, and that is not explicitly delegated to the power of the United States, are powers that the states have. Okay? Now, moving on, the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment will become hugely important. It is probably one of the most important amendments that was added to the Constitution. You have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and these are known as Civil War amendments. And what they do is make slavery illegal. With the 13th, the 14th Amendment expands citizenship rights to former slaves. And then the 15th Amendment gives voting rights to black men, right? Women still can't vote at this time. Okay, so why is the 14th Amendment so important? Well, because it's kind of dense and complicated. But the part that we're going to focus on today is this part right here that says, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of the citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Okay, so that's got a ton of stuff in there, right? It's got not depriving people of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. Okay, what law are they referring to? Can't abridge the privileges and immunities of the citizens of the United States, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Okay, well, what laws, right? Because we know that following the 14th Amendment, southern states are going to implement very harsh laws, right? Especially on the black population, especially on former slaves, right? Because they want to try to wrest that power back that they lost during the Civil War. But the 14th Amendment begins a slow, arduous process known as selective incorporation. And that's where the Bill of Rights starts applying slowly to the states, case by case. Not even case by case. I mean, it's amendment by amendment, and not even sometimes amendment by amendment. The First Amendment takes 4 court cases to completely incorporate it. Well, what do I mean by incorporation? Well, prior to the 14th Amendment, the Bill of Rights actually does not even apply to the states. What does that mean? Well, it means that the states could violate your rights prior to the 14th Amendment, right? Because the Bill of Rights explicitly mentions Congress, right? Right at the beginning, First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law, right? So if, for example, and then states did do this, right? If states wanted to make laws making certain religions illegal, if they wanted to make it to where free speech was not accepted in the state level, they could do that. And it's not until the 14th Amendment, it's not until after the Civil War that we actually see a beginning of a process. And not even all of the Bill of Rights are incorporated today, right? And that's hugely important. This selective incorporation process means the states can no longer violate the Bill of Rights, whereas previously they could, right? And obviously they were doing it in the southern states in a really grotesque ways with slavery. Right? And that's what the whole kind of point of the 14th Amendment is. So the states can no longer violate the Bill of Rights. So what in effect does this do to the power of the states? Well, it lessens the power of the states, right? The states no longer have the power to do the things that they wanted to do, especially during that time. Okay, so let's move on to the Commerce Clause. So, Commerce Clause is in Article 1, Section 8, and it is Clause 3 of the Constitution. Article 1, you can think of these things as in order of importance. So, Article 1 goes over Congress because the founders thought that Congress was the most important branch of government, right? They believed that Congress is closest to the people, at least the House of Representatives at the time, is closest to the people, and it should have the majority of sovereignty over the country. Second article, or Article 2, is the executive branch of the president. And then last, almost as like an afterthought, is the Supreme Court, which is also a very short part of the Constitution. Okay? So Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 says Congress has the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. So what does this mean? Well, basically this brings up the idea of interstate commerce. And that means that if something moves between states, Congress is going to have a much easier time legally regulating it. Okay? 2 really important cases that come up for the Commerce Clause are McCulloch versus Maryland. McCulloch versus Maryland is an early Supreme Court case. It says that Congress has the power to incorporate a bank, and that Maryland cannot tax this bank, right? So how do we get there? How do we get to Congress has the power to regulate commerce to Congress can form a bank and the state of Maryland can't tax that bank? Well, this is where we get another kind of thing known as the necessary and proper clause, right? So Congress can regulate commerce. So as would be implied, it can have a bank, because to regulate commerce implies that you need something to be able to do that with, right? So using a bank would be really useful in that instance, right? Another explicit power of the government or of Congress is to levy taxes. Okay, well, how are they going to levy taxes? How is Congress going to levy taxes? Like, imagine you're somebody who's incapable of reading things not perfectly literally. And you read Congress has the power to raise taxes. What does that mean? Does that mean that Ted Cruz is going to come knocking on your door with the sack out, ready to collect taxes? No. For one, they wouldn't be able to do that. 320 million people in the United States. It would be infeasible. It would be, comical. No, they're not going to do that. What they're going to do is create not a branch. They're going to create a organization, the IRS, a service, the Internal Revenue Service, that's going to collect taxes for them, right? This is propped up by the Supreme Court, who understands that Congress actually has to create organizations and subunits of the executive branch to carry out its duties, okay? Now, this will get Congress into some trouble in the future, because Congress kind of pushes off a lot of its responsibilities onto these executive agencies. Well, what's the problem with executive agencies if you're Congress? They're not controlled by Congress. They're controlled by who? The president, right? So that becomes a huge issue. Another case, another Commerce Clause case that's really important is U.S. v. Lopez. And this is a really kind of interesting one, because in this case, a kid brings a gun to a school, and he is charged with a federal, not just a state, but a federal crime, which is having a gun in a gun-free zone. Okay. Well, he challenges this, and this takes it all the way to the Supreme Court. It says that the possession of a gun in a local school zone does not violate the Commerce Clause, because that is not economic activity. Other people disagree and say, guns are absolutely something that can be regulated by the federal government. They, of course, move across state lines unless they were created in the state that it was used in. And further, that education itself is an economic activity that should be able to be protected, right? Because if we expect our economy to be booming, we need to have educated people in this country. And if we can't expect safety and security in our schools, then we can't really do that. Well, the Supreme Court doesn't buy that argument. Ultimately, they say that possession of a gun in a school zone does not have a substantial effect on interstate commerce. Therefore, the Congress cannot have a law that forbids guns nationally. Now, we have this at state levels. Of course, the states can do it, but nationally, the Congress can't. Okay. All right. Last thing that I want to touch upon is full faith and credit. I don't want to spend too much time on full faith and credit, because practically, you don't see a whole lot of problems with full faith and credit, especially today. Right? Full faith and credit says that states have to respect the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. Okay, well, if you're somebody like me, you might say, well, doesn't this just completely blow up the idea of separation of states and states having their own laws in the first place? A little bit, but ultimately, the courts rule and have ruled that when states make their own laws, they generally apply to their own states. Where we really saw issues with this was like same-sex marriage. So what happens when somebody married in Massachusetts, a same-sex couple marries in Massachusetts, and then they move down to a state like Texas where it wasn't legal? That's all moot now, though, right? Because Obergefell v. Hodges has completely made this not an issue, right? Same-sex marriage is legal across the entirety of the United States. So it's not something that full faith and credit applies to. Okay? All right. So that is it for our discussion of federalism today. I hope that helped you guys out. Have a good one. Bye.